The real reason you fear success and sabotage what you actually want. There's a specific moment in the journey of personal growth that almost no one prepares for. It's not the beginning, where doubt is loud and chaos is expected. It's not the rock bottom moment when pain makes change feel urgent. It's the part right before everything is about to shift, the part where clarity starts to form, momentum builds, and your effort begins to pay off. And yet, just when it's all lining up, you pull back. Maybe you didn't notice it at first. Maybe it looked like overthinking, or suddenly feeling tired, or needing just one more week to get ready. Maybe you told yourself it was intuition, that something wasn't quite aligned. But deep down, a question kept surfacing. Why am I hesitating now that things are finally working? This is the paradox that most people live in but can't explain. You say you want to move forward. You're no longer lost. The path is visible, the next step is obvious, and still, you freeze, you stall, you delay. You create complexity where there was once clarity. And the worst part? You know you're doing it. Not in a self-destructive, reckless way, but in quiet, rational decisions that make sense on the surface. You cancel. You postpone. You tell yourself you need to go deeper. But what if the truth is simpler? What if you're not afraid of failing, but afraid of what happens if this time you don't? That's where this conversation begins. Not at the level of behavior, but at the level of emotional logic, where your body holds stories about what success has meant in the past, and why part of you might still be resisting it now. This isn't laziness. It's not a mindset block. It's a nervous system trying to protect you from a future that feels unfamiliar, unpredictable, and emotionally expensive. So before you force your way forward again, stop, pause, let's decode this moment together. Because this isn't the part where you fail, it's the part where your internal programming gets exposed. And the way you respond now determines whether you loop again, or finally shift into a version of you that's not afraid to succeed. The invisible fear behind your own momentum. It's easy to blame hesitation on lack of discipline. To believe that if you just pushed a little harder, focused a little better, or wanted it more, you wouldn't be stuck. But often, what looks like resistance is actually protection, not from failure, but from what success might disrupt. Success doesn't just bring results. It brings responsibility, change, visibility, a shift in how others see you and how you see yourself. And if part of you still believes that becoming more will cost you connection, love, safety, or control, then success isn't appealing, it's dangerous. The fear here isn't loud. It doesn't scream in panic, it whispers in logic. Let's be smart. Let's wait until we're really ready. Let's not move too fast and ruin it. But that hesitation doesn't come from clarity. It comes from an emotional contract your system made years ago. Stay small, stay safe. And so, without realizing it, you begin to sabotage momentum, not with chaos, but with caution. You delay the post. You cancel the call. You retreat from opportunities you once prayed for. Not because they're wrong, but because they trigger a nervous system that still associates progress with threat. It's subtle. It's internal. And it doesn't mean you're broken, it means you're loyal. Loyal to the version of you who survived by staying in the background. The one who learned it was safer to dream than to become. This is why clarity often feels heavier than confusion. When you're unclear, you have time. You can plan, wait, hope. But when you know what you want and you still don't act, that's when you're forced to confront the truth. Something inside you still believes you're not safe on the other side of success. The work now isn't to force momentum. It's to understand what it's threatening. Because if you don't name the real fear, you'll keep calling it procrastination when it's actually self-protection wearing a very reasonable mask. Success feels unsafe when your identity didn't ask for it. You can consciously want something and still unconsciously reject it. That's not weakness. That's what happens when your identity wasn't built to hold what you're trying to receive. If you spent years surviving in scarcity, managing chaos, or proving your worth through effort, then success isn't just a new reality, it's an identity threat. Because the moment things begin to feel stable or easy or abundant, your nervous system starts looking for the catch. Not because you're negative, but because calm never felt like home. This is what most people miss. Success isn't just about doing something new. It's about becoming someone new. And that becoming disrupts the internal rules you once lived by. Rules like, struggle makes me worthy. If it's easy, it's not real. If I grow, I'll lose connection. These beliefs weren't chosen. They were inherited, repeated, felt. So when you begin to succeed, part of you celebrates, but another part panics. Because now you're stepping out of the emotional ecosystem that kept your identity intact. And your body doesn't just feel unsafe in the unknown. It feels unanchored without the old roles that made you feel needed, understood, or grounded. This is why so many high-potential people sabotage after progress. It's not about fear of failure. It's about fear of internal contradiction. They're trying to live in a new reality with an outdated sense of self. And the deeper that gap becomes, the heavier success feels. Because your body will not sustain what your identity doesn't believe it's safe to hold. That's why pushing harder doesn't work. You can't discipline your way into a version of you your nervous system still sees as unfamiliar. You have to rebuild that safety first, by making sure the person you're becoming isn't seen as a threat by the part of you who kept you alive when success wasn't an option. Until that happens, success will always feel like something you can chase, but not keep. What your nervous system learned about visibility. Most people think they're afraid of being judged. But the deeper fear, the one that keeps you stuck, is the fear of being seen. Not just noticed, but exposed. Seen in your clarity, seen in your power, seen in your voice. Because being seen doesn't just amplify your light. It also reveals what you once kept hidden to survive. Visibility brings a strange kind of pressure. Not just the pressure to succeed, but the pressure to stay consistent with the version of yourself others now expect. When people begin to reflect your growth back to you, you no longer have permission to hide behind the old narrative. You can't play small without it being obvious. And that feels terrifying. Because if you were ever shamed for being confident, mocked for being expressive, or punished for standing out, your body remembers. It doesn't matter how long ago it happened, your nervous system still links being seen with emotional risk. So when you begin to step into a more visible, authentic version of you, your body sends a signal. This is dangerous. You feel it as anxiety before posting, as hesitation before speaking, as the urge to downplay your wins or explain yourself when you're not doing anything wrong. This isn't low self-esteem. It's a protective reflex from a system that hasn't yet learned the difference between exposure and expression. And here's the most painful part. If you don't feel safe being seen, you will unconsciously dim the parts of you that are most powerful. You'll flatten your voice. You'll shrink your impact. You'll keep editing yourself to stay acceptable, not to others, but to the nervous system still trying to keep you safe in a world that no longer exists. Visibility is not just a social experience, it's a somatic one. It brings up old memory, emotional residue, unprocessed shame. And unless you actively retrain your body to feel grounded in the spotlight, you will keep retreating into the shadows, not because you want to disappear, but because disappearing still feels safer than being fully known. Until visibility feels safe, success will always feel threatening. Self-sabotage is the body protecting the past. When people hear the word self-sabotage, they usually think of laziness, fear, or a lack of commitment. But the truth is, sabotage is almost never about failure. It's about protection. It's the nervous system intervening to keep you from reliving pain it hasn't processed yet, even if that means holding you back from everything you say you want. Your body doesn't just carry memory, it carries logic. Emotional logic. The kind that says, last time we were that visible, we got hurt. Last time we spoke up, someone left. Last time we reached higher, we fell harder. And because your body doesn't think in timelines, it still interprets anything that resembles the past as a threat happening now. So when you start moving toward expansion, when you take the risk, show up with more power, or start letting things be easier, your system interprets the shift as destabilizing. And then it activates its defenses. You don't get attacked by fear. You get subtly redirected by your own survival patterns. Suddenly, you're too busy to finish. You're second-guessing a plan you felt clear about days ago. You feel drained for no clear reason. These aren't just habits. They're symptoms of an internal system trying to protect the you that still lives in a state of emotional readiness, expecting to be punished for succeeding or abandoned for changing. And the deeper truth? That part of you isn't trying to ruin your future. It's trying to keep you loyal to a past it still believes defines you. That's why affirmations, strategy, and willpower only work up to a point. If the emotional cost of change still feels too high, your body will reverse engineer failure just to stay within the range it knows how to survive. So instead of asking, "Why am I sabotaging this?" try asking, "What part of me still feels unsafe in the version of life I'm building?" Because until you update the emotional logic beneath your choices, sabotage won't feel like sabotage. It'll feel like relief, like coming back to the emotional gravity you didn't realize you were still orbiting. And that gravity always pulls hardest right when you're about to break free. Chronic readiness is a disguised survival pattern. There's a version of self-sabotage that's often praised, even admired. It's the version that stays in preparation, the one that always needs more research, more reflection, more healing before taking action. It looks responsible. It feels thoughtful. But underneath, it's not caution. It's a nervous system trying to delay risk by disguising fear as logic. You say you're being intentional, that you just want to get it right. But notice how every time you get close to the edge of expansion, you pull back into the comfort of preparation. You make another list, revisit another course, decide it's not quite time yet. And it's always almost time, but never now. That's not slowness. That's a trauma response. Because if your system still equates action with danger, expression with judgment, or progress with punishment, then the safest place to stay is on the edge. Close enough to believe you're growing. Far enough that nothing actually has to change. This pattern often forms when you once moved forward and paid an emotional price. Maybe you spoke up and got shamed. Maybe you tried and failed in a way that cost you connection. Maybe you succeeded and were met with silence instead of support. So now your system waits, not because you're not ready, but because your body still believes readiness equals protection. But here's the paradox. The longer you stay in readiness, the more exhausted you become. Because you're not just preparing, you're suppressing. You're keeping your potential on pause, hoping that clarity will show up to relieve you of the burden of deciding. It won't, because readiness is rarely a moment that arrives. It's a decision you make despite not feeling ready. It's what happens when you stop asking your fear for permission and start trusting your capacity to grow inside the discomfort. And until that happens, the readiness will never be real, because what you're actually trying to do is feel safe without having to risk anything. But the life you want doesn't exist in that loop. It starts when you break it. If you lose the struggle, who are you then? There's a question that rises quietly at the edge of growth, just beneath your awareness. It's not what if I fail? It's what if I succeed and no longer have the struggle to hold on to? For many people, struggle isn't just a phase of life. It's an identity. It's the scaffolding that holds your sense of purpose, belonging, and emotional structure in place. When you've spent years surviving, fixing, striving, or proving, struggle gives you something to do. It gives you a reason to keep going. And oddly, it can feel safer than the stillness that comes with getting what you want. Because what happens when there's nothing left to fix? That's where the fear hides. Not in the possibility of failure, but in the possibility that success will take away the very friction that made you feel real. The tension that gave your life shape, the effort that made your worth visible. And so, without realizing it, you create new struggle, not because you're addicted to pain, but because pain is where you once found clarity, connection, and direction. This is identity inertia, the emotional momentum of who you've been pulling against who you're becoming. You've upgraded your goals, but you haven't yet grieved the version of you that lived in the fight. And until that grief is honored, part of you will keep pulling yourself back, just far enough to still feel the edge of resistance that once made you feel alive. So you complicate what could be simple, delay what could be received, start over instead of stabilizing. Not because you lack clarity, but because clarity without struggle still feels like loss. To move beyond this loop, you have to let go of the emotional contract that says I only matter when I'm overcoming something. You have to build a new version of identity, one that isn't defined by what you're pushing through, but by what you're allowing yourself to hold without tension. Because your next chapter isn't about becoming stronger. It's about learning how to exist without needing a war to justify your presence. Guilt, loyalty, and the hidden cost of growing. Growth always sounds good in theory, but when it starts to actually change your life, it quietly threatens the emotional contracts that once held your relationships, identity, and sense of belonging together. Because whether you realize it or not, many of your self-imposed limits weren't built to keep you small. They were built to keep you connected. You stayed quiet to stay loved. You held back to keep the peace. You struggled so others wouldn't feel left behind. And you minimized your potential so the people you care about wouldn't feel like they were losing you. This is the kind of sabotage no one talks about. Not the one fueled by fear, but by loyalty. You start to grow, and suddenly, guilt creeps in. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the version of you that's evolving no longer fits the unspoken emotional agreement you had with the people around you. Agreements like, we don't talk about that, we don't stand out, we don't outgrow the struggle we shared. And so, without ever saying it aloud, part of you pulls back, you turn down opportunities. You soften your language. You make yourself easier to digest, not for your growth, but for their comfort. You try to stay close by staying small. But here's the truth. Shrinking yourself to maintain connection is still sabotage, even if it's done out of love. Because eventually, you'll start to resent the people you're trying to protect. Not because they asked you to stop growing, but because you assumed you had to choose between expansion and belonging. You don't. But to realize that, you have to confront the emotional guilt that says thriving means abandonment. You have to revisit the moments where love was conditional, where worth came from staying in the same pain. And you have to give yourself permission to grow anyway, knowing that some people might feel distant, confused, even hurt. That's not your failure. That's what happens when you change the emotional rules of a system that only knew how to love you through your struggle. And the deeper you root into your own truth, the more you'll see the people who love you for real don't need you to stay small. They just need you to stay honest. The emotional weight of having what you asked for. No one warns you about the heaviness that comes after the breakthrough. You work, you push, you envision the life you want, and then it starts to arrive. The results come in, the opportunities appear. You're no longer chasing, you're holding. And that's when something unexpected happens. Instead of feeling relief, you feel pressure, weight, emotional noise. Because having what you asked for isn't always light. It often comes with responsibility, with visibility, with a new internal standard that your nervous system wasn't trained to carry. Before, you could blame the struggle. You could fix, build, reach. That gave you purpose. But now there's less to fix and more to sustain. And if your self-worth was built on effort and striving, then stability won't feel satisfying. It'll feel hollow. Like something's missing, even though nothing's wrong. This is the shadow of success. The emotional tension between who you were while building and who you need to become in order to keep what you've built. And if that identity shift hasn't been integrated, you'll unconsciously drop the very things you worked so hard to earn. Not because you're failing, but because they still feel foreign. You'll feel the urge to self-sabotage, not with chaos, but with a quiet unraveling. You miss a deadline. You stop showing up fully. You say yes to things that scatter your focus. Not because you're overwhelmed, but because part of you is trying to return to the emotional baseline that made more sense. Being in motion, in the hustle, in the tension. You're not alone in this. Most people aren't afraid to succeed. They're afraid to stay successful without losing themselves. So the work now is not to strive harder. It's to expand your capacity to hold what's already here. To make it familiar, safe, grounded. Because if you don't train your system to receive without collapsing, you'll keep building things you're too afraid to live inside of. You don't need more tools. You need more presence in the life that's already becoming yours. You can't sustain a life that still feels foreign. You can build a new life, new habits, new patterns, new standards. But if your nervous system still sees it as unfamiliar, it won't matter how perfect it looks on paper. You won't stay there. Not because you're broken, but because your system doesn't sustain what it doesn't recognize as home. We are wired for familiarity, not fulfillment. And that means even a healthier, more aligned life can feel threatening if it challenges the emotional blueprint your body learned to survive inside. You can have peace and still feel restless. You can have freedom and still feel trapped. You can have success and still sabotage it, not because you don't want it, but because it doesn't feel like you. That feeling of mismatch isn't psychological, it's somatic. Your body has been trained by years of experience, emotion, and repetition to equate certain sensations with safety. Chaos might feel familiar, urgency might feel useful, conflict might feel like connection. And when those patterns fall away, what's left is a disorienting silence. You might interpret that silence as boredom, but it's not. It's the absence of survival cues. And if you've never lived outside those cues before, the calm will feel alien. You'll start creating tension again, not because you need it, but because your system is looking for something it knows how to regulate around. This is why people cycle back into patterns they thought they'd outgrown. They mistake peace for emptiness, consistency for confinement, progress for pressure. And they leave the life they built, not because it failed them, but because they never learned how to feel safe inside it. You don't need to destroy what you've created to feel alive. You need to update your inner world to match the reality you've built. That means teaching your body that stability is not abandonment, that rest is not laziness, that being seen is not a threat, and that it's possible to feel at home in a life that once felt too big to belong to you. Because until that happens, your body will keep dragging you back to the only place it knows how to protect you, the past. Discipline collapses when it protects a false self. Discipline is a powerful tool, but it has a hidden flaw. When it's used to force progress on top of an unresolved identity, it creates pressure without alignment. You can build habits, hit goals, show up consistently, and still feel like you're cracking inside. Because discipline can't hold what your self-concept doesn't believe is yours to carry. This is why people who appear successful on the outside often feel like imposters on the inside. They're not faking their skill. They're faking their sense of safety. Their discipline is being used to protect a version of them that doesn't feel worthy of what they've achieved. And so every action becomes a form of overcompensation, effort used not to express who they are, but to prove they belong. But here's the truth. You can't sustain a life that's built to validate a self you no longer want to be. That's why you burn out. That's why you sabotage after progress. That's why no level of achievement ever feels like enough, because you're using discipline to outrun a contradiction instead of resolving it. The contradiction sounds like this: I want to grow, but I'm scared of who I'll become. I want to be seen, but I don't feel safe being visible. I want to thrive, but I still feel more like a survivor. And as long as those emotional fractures go unaddressed, your discipline will eventually collapse, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. Real discipline isn't about force. It's about coherence. It's what happens when the person taking action believes in who they are becoming. It's not push, it's alignment. So if you're constantly pushing and still not progressing, maybe the issue isn't how hard you're trying. Maybe it's who you think you have to be in order to deserve what you're trying to build. Until you update that, your effort will keep compensating for a self-image that quietly says, "This isn't who I am." And that's not a discipline issue. That's an identity one. Expansion must feel safe to become sustainable. You cannot force your way into the life you want if your body still believes it's unsafe to live there. You can visualize it, script it, plan it, but until your nervous system feels safe inside that reality, your actions will unconsciously work to escape it. This is the missing piece in most conversations about growth. Not what you're doing, but how your system is interpreting what you're doing. Are you expanding from a place of grounded self-trust? Or are you expanding while holding your breath, waiting for something to go wrong? Safety isn't created by the outcome. It's created by the internal conditions you build along the way, and those conditions come from honesty. From noticing when your body tightens every time you receive praise. From observing when you downplay clarity to avoid conflict. From understanding that your resistance isn't always sabotage. Sometimes it's a signal. I don't feel safe here yet. Making expansion sustainable means pausing at those signals, not pushing through them. It means regulating your body while you're growing, not just recovering after you collapse. It means giving yourself permission to experience ease, peace, visibility, without immediately interpreting those experiences as signs that something's off. Because here's what's real. If you only know how to feel safe in struggle, you will unconsciously create just enough chaos to stay within the emotional temperature your system can handle. You'll sabotage rest. You'll undercut ease. You'll resist success. Not because you don't want it, but because you haven't yet learned how to stay in it. And that's the work, not more effort, not more strategy, but making your nervous system a place where expansion feels normal, safe, familiar, deserved. When that happens, you stop having to convince yourself to grow, because now you're not just tolerating the life you want, you're regulated enough to receive it. The moment you stop waiting for permission. There's a quiet pause in every journey, a moment when you realize the only thing between you and the life you say you want is the belief that someone else has to approve it first. That someone else needs to confirm you're ready, qualified, allowed. So you wait. You stall your power behind performance. You delay your voice until it feels safer. You keep becoming without arriving, but no permission slip is coming. Not from your past. Not from your peers. Not even from the future version of you who already lives in the outcome. Because the truth is, the only person who can release you is the version of you who's still afraid to claim what's already hers. And here's where it shifts. Not in another breakthrough, not in a moment of sudden clarity, but in a quiet internal decision. I don't need to earn the right to stop sabotaging. I need to stop negotiating with the version of me who never knew what safety felt like. You're not afraid of success. You're afraid of what success might strip away, the old identity, the emotional contracts, the roles that kept you accepted but limited. And now you stand at a threshold where none of that fits anymore. So what happens if you walk forward anyway? Not perfectly, not loudly, but with the kind of grounded clarity that says, I am no longer waiting to be chosen. I am choosing. Because the moment you stop asking for permission to become who you already are, is the moment everything that once felt blocked starts to move. Not because you forced it, but because the resistance was never about the future. It was about the version of you still trying to survive the past. You don't need to outrun that version. You just need to stop letting her decide how much of your life you're allowed to live. And that begins the second you decide, I'm ready to hold what I've spent years preparing for. No more waiting. No more shrinking. This is where you stop circling clarity and start inhabiting it.